Elena thought she could blend in, just another quiet assistant in a house full of power and secrets. But when Alessandro DeMarco, the city's most feared man, saw her tug her sleeve to hide the scar on her wrist, everything stopped. His voice turned sharp as he asked who hurt her, but she didn't answer. No one could know where that scar came from, or who was still looking for her. What Elena didn't realize was that by hiding it, she had just put herself at the center of a danger even he couldn't control. Elena arrived at the DeMarco estate just after dawn, the iron gates towering like a warning. She clutched her small bag tightly, telling herself it was just another job. The driver who brought her didn't speak a word, and when the mansion appeared through the fog, she understood why. It was grand but cold, the kind of place built to keep people out. She had been in difficult homes before, but nothing like this. The guards at the door looked her over, then waved her through as if she didn't matter. That part suited her fine. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish and smoke. Every footstep echoed. A woman in a dark suit guided Elena to a long table where papers waited. The woman didn't introduce herself, just pointed to the line she needed to sign. Elena's hand trembled as she wrote her name. She kept her sleeve pulled low, careful not to show the scar. The contract looked ordinary: hours, duties, pay. But something about the language felt off. She wondered what kind of man needed this much protection around him. Maybe she didn't want to know. When Alessandro entered, the energy in the room shifted like air before a storm. He wasn't loud or impatient. He didn't need to be. His presence filled the space, and even the woman who'd been giving orders stepped back. Elena kept her head down, pretending to read. She could sense his gaze, sharp and steady. He asked if she was ready to start, his tone calm but heavy. She nodded without looking up. For a second she thought she could feel him studying her hands. She wished she'd worn longer sleeves that day. Her first task was to organize files in his office, a space lined with dark shelves and old photographs. She moved quietly, careful not to draw attention. The photos caught her eye. Soldiers, family gatherings, and one picture where a young boy stood beside a man she recognized from the news. She turned it face down. Something about the boy's eyes looked too much like Alessandro's. The computer on his desk hummed, screens filled with numbers and coded documents she didn't understand. It was clear his world was built on secrets, and now she worked inside it. Later that day, a stack of papers slipped from her hands, scattering across the floor. She knelt to gather them, only to see a pair of black shoes stop in front of her. Alessandro crouched beside her, wordless, helping. For a second, his hand brushed hers, and his eyes caught the faint line across her wrist. She felt heat crawl up her neck. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence spoke more than words. Then quietly, he asked where she got that mark. She said it was nothing, just an accident. He didn't believe her. After he left, she sat frozen, her heart pounding against the quiet. She should have worn gloves, should have stayed in data entry instead of this job, but the pay had been too good to refuse, and she needed a new identity fast. In her room that night, she unwrapped the small bandage from her wrist and stared at the scar. It wasn't deep anymore, but it carried weight. A reminder, a warning. She pressed her palm over it, whispering to herself to stay invisible. She couldn't afford another mistake, not here. The next morning, she noticed how the staff avoided Alessandro's name. They called him Signor, or just him. Even the guards wouldn't meet his eyes. She followed instructions closely, speaking only when asked. The mansion felt like a fortress. Every hallway watched, every conversation overheard. Still, Alessandro's attention lingered. She could sense when he entered a room even before seeing him. His steps were measured, his tone always calm, but the air thickened in his presence. She didn't know if he was curious or suspicious. Either way, she couldn't let him dig too deep. During lunch, she ate alone, in a small corner of the kitchen. The cook, an older man with tired eyes, slid her a cup of coffee without asking. He said, "Newcomers never lasted long." She forced a smile and said she'd try. Later, she saw Alessandro speaking to someone near the balcony. His posture sharp, his hand cutting through the air like command. For a moment, his gaze shifted, locking on her through the glass. It wasn't anger, it was something else. Interest, maybe. She turned away, pretending not to notice, though her hands betrayed her unease. That evening, a thunderstorm rolled through the city. Elena stayed late to finish reports, the rain tapping against tall windows. When she stood to leave, Alessandro appeared in the doorway, silent. He watched her gather her papers, his expression unreadable. He asked if she was settling in. She said yes, though her voice barely carried. As she reached for her bag, her sleeve slid down again. His eyes caught the mark. This time, he didn't ask. He just watched her pull the fabric back over it, as if he already understood it wasn't an accident. In her room, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to distant footsteps in the hallway. Her mind replayed that moment in his office, the look in his eyes. She feared curiosity more than anger. Curiosity meant involvement, and involvement meant risk. She sat up, clutching her wrist again, the skin faintly burning, as if the scar remembered pain. She wanted to believe she was free from the past, but deep down, she knew better. Freedom didn't exist for people like her. It just meant hiding longer. Days passed, and Alessandro's questions became subtler. He'd ask where she learned to type so fast, where she lived before this, what languages she spoke. She always gave vague answers, enough to sound harmless, but she saw the way he watched her when she wasn't looking, the way he measured silence. He wasn't used to people avoiding him. Most tried to please him, to be seen. Elena did the opposite. That alone made her stand out. He began assigning her tasks that brought her closer to his personal world. It didn't feel like a coincidence. He had her deliver documents directly to his office, where he'd linger too long after signing them. His desk always smelled faintly of tobacco and expensive cologne, a scent she now carried home with her clothes. She found herself staying longer, unsure if it was fear or fascination that kept her there. One evening, he asked her to check the filing cabinets behind his chair. As she leaned over, her sleeve slipped again. He didn't comment, but she felt his eyes on her hand, and the silence stretched like a held breath. The staff began whispering. Some avoided her entirely. One woman muttered that the boss had never shown interest in anyone before. Elena pretended not to hear. She had dealt with rumors all her life, but these ones made her skin prickle. She didn't want attention, not from anyone, especially not from him. But Alessandro seemed to move through her days like a shadow she couldn't escape. Every glance felt like a test, every task a chance to expose what she was running from. She told herself she would leave before it got worse. She didn't. One night, after the others went to bed, she stepped into the courtyard for air. The rain had stopped, leaving the stone paths slick and shining under the lights. From the balcony above, Alessandro stood with a glass in hand, staring out at the city. She froze when he spoke her name, his tone quiet but commanding. He asked why she always looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. She said she didn't. He didn't respond, only nodded once before turning away. She felt his gaze stay long after he was gone. In her room, Elena peeled back her sleeve again. The scar looked the same, yet every day it seemed to carry more weight. She touched it gently, remembering the night she earned it, the screaming, the burning metal, the warning not to speak. She told herself it was over, that no one could find her here. But as she turned off the lamp, she caught a reflection in the window, a figure standing outside by the gate. She blinked, and it was gone. Still, sleep never came. Somewhere deep down, she knew it had started again. That night, Elena sat by the window, staring at the gate. She thought she saw someone standing near. The estate was quiet now, only the sound of the fountain breaking the silence. She tried to convince herself her mind was playing tricks, but deep down, she knew she wasn't safe. Her old life had a way of finding her, no matter how far she ran. She closed the curtain and reached for her journal, writing only 3 words before stopping. He's watching again. The ink smudged as she pressed her hand too hard against the paper. That evening, while organizing files, she opened a drawer she hadn't seen before. Inside was a stack of old letters, each sealed but never sent. The handwriting looked familiar. One letter had her first name written in a way only one person used to write it. Her stomach turned. She closed the drawer and stepped back. There was no reason that name should exist in this house. She heard footsteps approaching, so she hurriedly shoved the papers back and pretended to work. When Alessandro entered, she kept her head down, hoping he hadn't noticed anything. He asked her to pour him a drink, his tone calm but firm. As she handed the glass, he said he wanted honesty between them. She nodded, avoiding his eyes. He mentioned the scars people hide usually say more than their words. She didn't reply. His words carried weight, but she couldn't let him in. He studied her a moment longer, then told her to go home. When she left his office, her hands shook, not from fear, but from something else, confusion. No one had ever looked at her the way he did, like he was trying to understand. Later that night, as she returned to her room, a white envelope lay on the floor near her door. No handwriting, no seal. She picked it up, feeling the rough paper brush against her fingertips. Inside was a photograph. Sleep refused to come. She sat on her bed, staring at the torn photo now half hidden under a crumpled paper. Every sound made her tense. The distant ticking of the clock, the wind brushing against the windows, all of it felt louder tonight. She thought about calling the police. But what would she say? That her past was sending her reminders. She had no proof of anything, only fear. Finally, she got up, opened the window, and let the cold air hit her face. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once, then nothing. The night swallowed the sound completely. At sunrise, she took the photo pieces outside and burned them behind the servants' quarters. The ashes rose into the air like smoke from an old memory. She told herself this was the end of it, that she could move on. When she turned back toward the mansion, Alessandro stood by the door, watching quietly. He asked what she was burning. She said it was old papers. Nothing important. His eyes stayed on her longer than usual, reading her silence. He didn't press further but walked away, leaving her with a sinking feeling that he already knew. Later that morning, Alessandro's tone had changed. It wasn't angry, but colder. He asked about her background again. This time with questions too specific to be casual, she answered carefully, sticking to her invented past. He nodded but didn't seem convinced. When she left his office, she could feel his gaze follow her until she turned the corner. Down the hall, two of his men whispered as she passed. They stopped when she looked their way. Something inside her told her the situation was shifting. Her time blending in was over. She could sense it in the air. That afternoon, she caught a glimpse of Alessandro speaking with his right-hand man, Matteo. They stood by the garden entrance, their voices low but tense. She only caught fragments. Her name, background, something about verification. Fear settled deep in her chest. She had changed her documents, erased her traces, started over completely. How could they find anything, unless someone had already given them what they needed? She returned to her room and checked her phone, deleting old contacts one by one. It didn't matter anymore who she lost, as long as she stayed hidden. That night she worked late again, unable to focus. She double-checked the reports, trying to ignore her shaking hands. Around midnight, she left them on Alessandro's desk. The office was empty, but his chair was turned slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. She noticed the faint smell of smoke, the kind from his cigarettes. She turned to leave when her eyes caught something unusual, a thin red thread hanging from the edge of the desk drawer. It looked out of place. She reached out to touch it, but before she could, the lights flickered and went dark. The entire house went black. Somewhere in the distance, a backup generator groaned to life, but her section stayed dark. She held her breath, waiting to hear footsteps or voices. Nothing came. Reaching for her phone, she turned on the flashlight and saw the thread again, this time tied around the drawer handle. Her heart tightened. It wasn't decoration, it was a mark. She pulled it free and tucked it in her pocket. Moments later, lights returned, and the hall guards appeared, confused. She said the outage scared her. It wasn't a lie. Fear had already moved in completely. The next morning, Alessandro asked if she'd noticed anything strange during the outage. She hesitated, then said no. He nodded slowly, as if expecting that answer. Later, she overheard him speaking to Matteo again, ordering him to increase surveillance. Whatever was happening, he didn't trust anyone, not even his own people. Elena stayed quiet, working faster than usual, but she caught his eyes on her multiple times. It wasn't suspicion anymore, it was something heavier, almost protective. She didn't want protection, protection meant exposure. Yet part of her couldn't deny how much safer she felt when he was near. That night, she thought she heard footsteps outside her door again. She pressed her ear to the wood, but couldn't tell where they came from. The steps stopped, replaced by a faint scraping sound near the lock. Her chest tightened. She waited, gripping the edge of the table beside her, then silence. When she opened the door, the hallway was empty. She checked the floor and found a small piece of paper torn from a notebook. It had only one line written in bold ink. "You can't hide forever." Her legs nearly gave out as she read the words again. She took the paper to the kitchen and burned it in the sink, watching the flames curl it into nothing. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Whoever sent it knew exactly where she was. That meant someone inside was working with them. She thought of Alessandro's men, their quiet stares, the whispers when she passed. One of them could have slipped it under her door. She needed to leave, but the idea of running again made her stomach turn. She was so tired of escaping. For the first time, she wondered if staying might be safer than fleeing. When she reported to Alessandro the next morning, he looked exhausted. He mentioned rumors of break-ins around the property and told her not to go anywhere alone. She nodded, though his warning came too late. As she left the office, he called after her, asking if she believed in coincidences. She didn't answer. His gaze lingered until she disappeared down the hall. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. When she played it, no one spoke, only the sound of a distant bell rang faintly through the speaker before the call ended. Before we move on, if you've been following Elena's story and want to know where this is going, take a second to stay with it. Every listener matters, and your support keeps these stories alive. That night, Elena replayed the voicemail several times. The ringing sound echoed in her head, long after it stopped. She didn't recognize it, but it felt familiar, like a memory she couldn't reach. She saved the recording before deleting the message history, just in case. The mansion felt heavier that evening, the corridors quieter. When she passed Alessandro's office, the door was slightly open. Inside, he stood alone, staring at a map on the wall. Red pins covered parts of the city. When his eyes lifted to hers, she froze. He said only one word, Belmore. She didn't know the name, but something in his tone made her uneasy. He asked if she had ever been there. She shook her head, though part of her hesitated. Belmore had been near the place she once lived under another name. He studied her face carefully, searching for a lie. Then, without another word, he dismissed her. That night, she couldn't sleep. She looked up Belmore on her phone, finding a single note in an old article about a DeMarco warehouse there that had caught fire years ago. She began to suspect the voicemail wasn't random. The next day, Alessandro's men loaded their cars with equipment. He announced an unplanned inspection of Belmore's remaining warehouse. No one questioned him. Elena overheard them mention old accounts and stolen shipments. She stayed out of the way, but curiosity pulled at her. That evening, Alessandro left alone. His driver said he wanted to see the place himself. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Elena waited by the window, the red thread still hidden in her pocket. When she finally saw headlights returning down the long road, something in her chest tightened. The car arrived without him. Matteo stepped out of the car, speaking quietly with the guards. Elena couldn't hear, but the look on his face was grim. He carried something wrapped in cloth. She recognized the shape immediately. A small, broken door handle. She remembered the red thread tied to one just like it. Without thinking, she ran downstairs. Matteo stopped her and said Alessandro had gone back to search another section. He told her not to worry, but his tone was too steady to be honest. She stayed up until sunrise, unable to rest until she saw Alessandro again. He returned just after dawn, his coat wet, his expression unreadable. She waited in the hall, unsure if she should approach. He walked past everyone, heading straight to his office. Hours later, he called for her. On his desk sat the same red thread, this time laid out in a neat circle. He asked her if she had ever seen it before. Her mind raced, but she lied, saying no. His eyes narrowed slightly. He said the symbol was used by someone who wanted to send a warning. She asked what kind of warning. He said, "One meant for me." After that, Alessandro changed. He moved through the house differently, more alert, less patient. He checked every corner, rechecked every file. The staff felt it too. Conversations grew shorter. Eyes darted more. Elena tried to stay out of sight, but she could feel the weight of his watchful presence. She found comfort in it, though she couldn't admit that to herself. Sometimes he'd appear in doorways silently, looking at her like she was both the problem and the answer. She wished she could disappear again, but something about his attention kept her tethered in place. That night, she woke to faint static from her phone. The voicemail was playing on its own. The bell sound grew louder, sharper this time, like it was closer. She turned it off, but the ringing continued faintly, echoing from somewhere outside. She went to the window and saw lights in the woods near the property. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, flashlights sweeping through the trees. The phone buzzed again, but this time it displayed no number. She turned it face down and sat there until the first light of dawn crept into her room. Later that morning, Alessandro summoned her again. His tone was softer now, almost tired. He asked if she had heard anything unusual overnight. She hesitated, then told him about the lights in the woods. His jaw tightened. He said he would take care of it, that she should stay inside. She started to leave, but he called her name once more. When she turned, he looked at her wrist. The edge of the scar was visible again. His voice dropped when he asked if the people in those woods were the same ones who gave it to her. She stayed silent. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, studying her face as if searching for an answer she wouldn't give. He told her she didn't have to face it alone. His voice was firm, not kind, but she understood it for what it was, a promise. She said she didn't want his pity. He shook his head, saying he didn't offer pity, only solutions. Before she could respond, the phone on his desk buzzed. Matteo's voice came through. They found something. Alessandro stood immediately and told her to lock her door until he returned. She watched him leave without another word. Hours passed. The mansion grew quiet again. She waited by her window, watching the road for headlights, but none appeared. The red thread still sat in her pocket. Now tangled and frayed, she held it tightly, not sure why. Something about it felt like a connection between her and whatever was coming next. Near midnight, she heard engines in the distance. Cars rolled through the gates. Men shouted briefly outside. She leaned closer to the glass and froze. The cars were Alessandro's, but his seat in the back was empty. Matteo was the first to speak when he returned. He told the staff to stay inside and ordered the guards to lock the gates. Elena stepped into the hallway, trying to catch what he was saying, but the men's voices dropped lower. From the fragments she heard, Alessandro was searching the outskirts of the property. Something had been found. Footprints. Tire marks. Maybe both. The men moved quickly, speaking in code. Elena slipped back to her room, her mind racing. If those prints belonged to who she thought they did, her time at the mansion was almost over. She tried calling Alessandro, but her phone went straight to voicemail. Every part of her told her to pack and leave, but she stayed frozen. Running would only make her look guilty. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the door, waiting for footsteps that didn't come. Hours dragged by until dawn's light filtered through the curtains. Finally, the sound of engines approached. She rushed to the window just in time to see Alessandro's car return. The door opened. He stepped out slowly, dust on his jacket, eyes sharp and unreadable. He was back. When he entered the house, the staff went silent. Elena stood near the stairs, unsure whether to speak. Alessandro saw her but didn't acknowledge her immediately. He gave orders in short, clipped words, telling Matteo to triple security. Then, without warning, he called Elena to follow him. She obeyed, her hands tightening around the red thread in her pocket. Inside his office, the smell of smoke lingered again. He told her he had been to the edge of the property. Someone had left a message. On his desk sat a folded piece of paper, marked with a single drop of blood. He slid the paper toward her. It had her name written on it, in messy, familiar handwriting. Her stomach dropped. The note inside said only 3 words. "You owe me." She backed away instinctively, shaking her head. Alessandro's voice turned low as he asked who wrote it. She refused to answer. He stepped closer, saying he couldn't protect her if she kept lying. She said protection was never what she wanted. For a long moment they stared at each other, the silence breaking only by the ticking clock. Finally, he folded the note and pocketed it without another word. After he dismissed her, Elena walked aimlessly through the corridor. Her reflection in the mirror beside the staircase caught her attention. She looked like someone else now, tired, thinner, more afraid. For years she had imagined escaping her past, but it had followed her like a shadow that never slept. She thought about leaving again, maybe by train, but every time she pictured it, Alessandro's face appeared. Something about his voice when he said her name made her hesitate. She hated that part of herself, the one that wanted to stay, even when logic screamed to run. By evening, Alessandro's men had set up extra guards outside her door. She told them it wasn't necessary, but they didn't respond. She felt trapped inside her own room. The scar on her wrist itched like a living thing. She rubbed it hard, trying to erase it, but all she did was make it redder. She took out the red thread from her pocket, wrapping it loosely around her wrist. It almost covered the scar completely. The strange comfort it gave her frightened her. The thread connected her to danger, yet somehow it also made her feel less alone. When Alessandro knocked later that night, she didn't answer right away. He told her he had news. She opened the door, half expecting anger, but his face held something else, worry. He said his men traced the blood on the note to a man named Marco Vescari. The name froze her. It was one she hadn't heard in years, yet it had never left her nightmares. Alessandro asked if she knew him. She said no too quickly. He didn't argue. He only said that Vescari was someone from his past as well, and if he was back, things were about to get ugly. After he left, she sat on the floor, the name echoing in her mind, Marco Vescari. She remembered his voice, the way he'd smiled when he pressed the heated metal into her wrist. She could almost smell the smoke again. He was the reason she ran, the reason she built a new name, a new life. She had thought he was dead. Now she wasn't sure of anything. She pressed her palm against the scar again, whispering to herself that she wouldn't be that scared girl anymore. But the trembling in her hands told another story entirely. The next morning, Alessandro didn't show up for breakfast. Matteo handled everything in his place. He said the boss was in meetings with old contacts, trying to confirm if Vescari was really alive. The news spread through the house like wildfire. The staff spoke in whispers, glancing at Elena as though she were connected. She could feel suspicion creeping through the walls. Later that day, a delivery arrived. No sender listed, just her name. Matteo handed it to her carefully, saying Alessandro wanted him to inspect it first. She insisted she'd handle it. Against his warning, she took it upstairs alone. In her room, she opened the box slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper resting atop something small and colorful. She moved the paper aside and froze. It was a child's drawing. Crayon lines filled the page. A crooked house surrounded by flames, stick figures standing nearby. Her breath caught when she noticed the initials in the corner. They were hers. She had drawn this years ago for her father, back when everything was still normal. The message was clear. Someone had found pieces of her old life. She folded the picture and locked it away in her drawer. She didn't tell Alessandro about the drawing. It felt too personal, too much like an open wound. Instead, she tried to keep her focus on work, though her thoughts wouldn't settle. That night, she found him in the garden, standing under the old olive tree. The moonlight caught the edge of his jaw, and for once, he looked less like a man of power and more like someone burdened by ghosts. She approached quietly. He said he had traced Vescari's network to an old DeMarco storage site. She asked what he planned to do. He said he'd finish what was started. Elena asked what that meant, but Alessandro didn't answer. He turned his gaze toward the sea, the city lights flickering in the distance. He said some debts take generations to pay, and some scars never heal. She felt the words strike her deeply, though he couldn't have known why. He looked at her wrist again, his eyes softening. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, he said that if anyone tried to reach her again, he would handle it personally. She didn't thank him. Gratitude felt dangerous here, almost as binding as fear itself. The next morning, the household buzzed with tension. Alessandro was leaving the estate for the day, and no one was told where he was going. Matteo stayed behind to manage operations. Elena tried to go about her routine, but unease followed her like a shadow. She caught sight of two guards whispering by the gate. One of them had a bruise on his cheek. When she asked what happened, they said nothing and walked away. Something was shifting in the power structure, something even the loyal men couldn't hide. The entire estate felt ready to break apart. By late afternoon, Alessandro returned with a cut above his eyebrow. He brushed past everyone, heading straight to his office. Matteo followed quickly behind him. From her seat near the stairwell, Elena overheard fragments of their heated conversation, words like betrayal, warehouse, and Belmore. She realized the situation was spiraling faster than either of them expected. She stood quietly until Matteo stormed out, his face pale. He didn't see her watching. When he passed, she noticed a smear of dried blood on his sleeve. The sight made her stomach twist. Something about this war wasn't just business anymore. Later that night, Alessandro called for her again. His voice over the intercom sounded different, strained, weary. When she entered his office, the lights were dim. Papers covered the desk, and a gun sat beside them, carelessly set down. He told her they had found proof that Vescari was alive. The man had been operating under another name, rebuilding quietly in the shadows. Alessandro said he planned to finish it, no matter the cost. She wanted to tell him to stop, that this endless revenge would destroy him, but she knew it wasn't her place to save him. Not yet. She asked what would happen if Vescari found her first. Alessandro's eyes met hers sharply, and for the first time, she saw genuine fear flicker in his expression. He said that would not happen. His voice carried finality, but she could hear the uncertainty behind it. He walked toward her, saying she had to trust him. She didn't respond. Trust had cost her everything once before. Still, something in her wanted to believe him. When she left the room, she realized her hands were trembling again, but this time, not entirely from fear. Something else was starting to take hold. Sleep came in pieces that night. She dreamed of the house from the drawing, the fire spreading faster than she could stop it. In the dream, Alessandro stood beside the flames, silent. When she woke, her wrist throbbed where the scar was. She looked at it under the lamp, noticing a faint redness she couldn't explain. It wasn't just a mark. It was reacting, as if remembering pain. She wrapped the red thread around it again and pressed her hand against her chest. The thread felt like both a curse and a promise, binding her to a fate she didn't understand. By morning, Alessandro had left again. Matteo informed her. He was attending a private meeting downtown. Hours passed without contact. Elena tried to distract herself by cleaning the study, but her eyes kept drifting to the window. Outside, rain began to fall. The estate felt hollow without him. She realized how much of her stability depended on his presence, a thought that unsettled her. When her phone buzzed, she expected another voicemail. Instead, it was a single message with no sender. "He's closer than you think." The words blinked once before the entire screen went black. Panic gripped her. She turned the phone off and placed it face down, but the screen lit up again by itself, showing the same message. She yanked the battery out and tossed it across the room. Her hands shook as she looked toward the window. Outside, the rain fell harder now, tapping against the glass like fingers. She drew the curtains closed and sat on the bed, trying to steady her breathing. Her mind replayed Alessandro's words about trust. For the first time, she wondered if she could actually trust anyone in this place, even him. The front gates opened later that night. She watched from her window as Alessandro's car returned. He didn't look up at her window this time. He walked straight inside, his movements slower than usual. She waited, expecting him to call her, but the house stayed silent. The red thread still rested around her wrist, now faintly stained from her skin. She thought of taking it off, but couldn't bring herself to. It felt like the only thing linking her to the truth. As the rain eased, she whispered a promise to herself, no more running, not this time. The next day began quietly, but an unease lingered over the estate. Alessandro gathered his men early, speaking in low voices near the garage. Elena pretended to organize files nearby, listening without drawing attention. He spoke of traitors within the ranks and eyes watching from inside. Matteo asked if he suspected anyone specific, but Alessandro said only that loyalty had a price. His words sent a chill through her. She realized that the enemy outside wasn't the only one she had to fear. The house itself was starting to feel like a cage closing around her. She decided to walk through the estate gardens to clear her head. The path was slick from last night's rain. Every step felt heavier than the one before. She stopped near the fountain and noticed a shape resting on the edge, a small jar wrapped in newspaper. Inside it was something dark and familiar. When she opened it, she realized it was ash. A note was taped to the lid. "For what you burned." Her heart dropped. Someone had been watching her when she destroyed the photograph. She placed the jar back and walked away, trying not to run. By the time she reached her room, her legs felt weak. She locked the door and sat on the floor, staring at her hands. She couldn't keep hiding the truth. Alessandro deserved to know who he was dealing with. Before she could convince herself otherwise, she grabbed her coat and went straight to his office. He was there, leaning over maps and reports. When he saw her, his expression softened slightly. She told him she needed to talk about the scar. His face went still, all attention fixed on her. He told her to close the door. Elena stood by his desk, her palms damp. She said the scar wasn't random. It was a mark given by Marco Vascari himself. Alessandro didn't move. His jaw tightened as she spoke. She told him about the night she ran, how her father had once worked for the Vascari family, and how they punished her for what he refused to reveal. She said she changed her name, disappeared, and never expected anyone to find her. Alessandro finally spoke, asking what her father had been hiding. She said she never knew. The only thing she remembered was the sound of a bell. For a long moment, Alessandro said nothing. Then, quietly, he admitted that he once worked for the same man before breaking away. The silence between them stretched. 2 lives, 2 scars, both born from the same monster. She asked what he would do now that he knew. He said he'd make sure Vascari never touched her again. She believed him, but deep down she feared that saving her would cost him everything. As she turned to leave, he said her father's death wasn't random. Someone inside the DeMarco circle helped make it happen. Elena left his office that night, feeling both lighter and heavier. She had finally spoken the truth, yet it bound her to him in a new way. Alessandro's confession about her father's death echoed in her mind. Someone inside his circle had helped kill the man she barely remembered. She returned to her room, sitting by the window, watching the waves crash beyond the garden walls. The red thread still circled her wrist like a reminder. She didn't know if it symbolized survival or doom, but she couldn't bring herself to remove it anymore. The following day, Alessandro summoned his closest allies for a private meeting. Elena wasn't supposed to be there, but he asked her to take notes. The men entered one by one, their faces tense. Alessandro announced that Marco Vascari was alive, rebuilding his operations under a new name. The reaction was immediate: shock, disbelief, fear. Then he mentioned her father's involvement and how his death was connected to a betrayal within their ranks. Eyes turned toward her. She felt them burning through her. Alessandro stopped the murmurs, saying no one would touch her without his word. That word carried power. After the meeting, one of Alessandro's oldest lieutenants, Carlo, pulled her aside. His tone was calm but cutting. He said loyalty was earned, not granted through pity. She didn't respond, but the look in his eyes chilled her. That night, when she returned to her room, her door was slightly open. She stepped inside carefully. Everything looked the same, except for one thing. The child's drawing she'd hidden was now sitting on her pillow. Nothing else was touched. She folded it quietly, realizing the threat wasn't only from outside the mansion anymore. Someone inside wanted her gone. The next morning, Alessandro appeared tired but determined. He gathered Matteo and 2 others, preparing to leave again. When Elena asked where he was going, he said he had unfinished business in Belmore. His tone left no room for argument. She tried to protest, saying it was too dangerous, but he only told her to lock her door and stay out of sight. As he walked out, she caught a glimpse of the scar above his eyebrow. It looked deeper now, almost like it refused to heal. just like hers. She didn't know if that was fate or punishment. After he left, time felt slower. Rain covered the windows again, blurring the outside world. Elena tried to work, but her thoughts wandered. She remembered his promise to protect her, his words about her father's death, and the way he looked at her when he said she could trust him. She wanted to believe him, but her instincts said trust had always been a dangerous thing. By evening, the power flickered again. She grabbed her phone, ready for another strange voicemail, but instead she heard a loud crash from the hall. Someone had broken something outside her door. She opened the door carefully. A vase lay shattered near the stairwell. The hallway was empty, except for the flickering light above. As she bent to pick up the pieces, she noticed a small piece of paper stuck under one shard. It read, "He's coming home." Her stomach tightened. She looked toward the window, realizing the storm had passed. The air outside was still. She went to Alessandro's office, but the door was locked. She didn't know who left the note, but it felt like a warning. Whether it meant Alessandro or someone else, she couldn't tell. Unable to sit still, she searched for Matteo. She found him near the garage, overseeing the guards. He looked pale, distracted. When she showed him the note, his expression hardened. He told her to forget it, that people were trying to scare her. His voice shook slightly, betraying unease. She asked when Alessandro would return, but Matteo didn't answer. Instead, he walked away, muttering something under his breath. Elena folded the note and slipped it into her pocket. Every shadow now seemed alive. Every whisper sounded like her name. The mansion felt less like a refuge and more like a warning. That night, she couldn't rest. She sat at her desk, listening to the wind outside. Then a faint sound reached her ears, the same bell from the voicemail. This time, it came from within the house. She stood slowly, following the noise down the hall. It led her toward the east wing, a part of the mansion rarely used. The door at the end stood open, though she remembered it always being locked. She stepped inside, her heartbeat steady but quick. Dust covered everything. In the middle of the room, she found something strange, a candle burning on its own. Next to the candle sat a small stack of papers tied with red thread. She recognized Alessandro's handwriting. The top sheet read, "DeMarco, the scary file." She untied the thread and flipped through the pages. Names, transactions, coded notes, all connecting the two families across decades. Her father's name appeared halfway down one list, marked asset, terminated. She swallowed hard. Near the bottom, one line caught her attention, child located. Extraction failed. Her hands trembled as she realized it referred to her. Before she could read further, the light flickered and footsteps echoed from behind her. She turned, expecting Alessandro. But it was Carlo. His expression was calm, almost cold. He asked why she was in that room. She stammered, saying she was looking for Alessandro. He stepped closer, shaking his head. He said Alessandro's weakness would ruin them all, and she was that weakness. She backed away, holding the papers tightly. Carlo's hand reached for her wrist, pulling the red thread loose. The scar glowed faintly in the candlelight. He looked at it with disgust, saying she carried Vascari's mark. She broke free and ran, clutching the files, his footsteps echoing behind her. She sprinted through the hallways, the papers slipping from her grasp. Carlo shouted for her to stop, but she didn't. She turned a corner sharply and burst into Alessandro's office. The guards nearby froze as she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her breathing steadied enough to look around. On his desk, maps were spread open, and a small black device blinked near the edge. It was a voice recorder. She pressed play. Alessandro's voice came through, low and tense. He was speaking to someone. Carlo. The recording caught only fragments, but enough to chill her. She's not supposed to know. Her stomach turned. Alessandro and Carlo had been working together, at least at one point. She replayed it, trying to understand. The conversation ended abruptly with a loud crash, then silence. She turned off the recorder just as Carlo's voice shouted outside the door. He demanded she open it, claiming Alessandro was gone. She didn't believe him. She scanned the desk for anything to defend herself. Her eyes landed on a small metal box with Alessandro's crest engraved on it. She didn't know what was inside, but she grabbed it and slipped it into her pocket before escaping through the side door. She ran toward the west wing, her footsteps muffled against the carpet. The guards were distracted near the front, shouting orders to each other. She slipped out through the side entrance and into the cold night. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy. The driveway stretched out in front of her like a dark ribbon. She hid behind the hedges, clutching the metal box. In the distance, headlights approached slowly. For a brief moment, she feared it was Vescari himself. But as the car pulled closer, she saw Alessandro step out, coat-drenched, face drawn tight. He saw her instantly, his eyes locking onto the fear in hers. She ran to him, words tumbling out about Carlo, the files, and the recording. He didn't speak at first, just led her back toward the mansion, scanning the grounds for movement. Inside, Matteo met them halfway, gun drawn. Alessandro ordered him to check the east wing immediately. When they reached his office, Carlo was gone. The candle, the papers, everything had vanished. Only a faint trace of smoke lingered. Alessandro picked up a single red thread from the floor and stared at it silently. He asked to see the metal box she'd found. She handed it over, still catching her breath. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded photograph, the same one she had burned days ago, somehow restored and clean. Behind it, a small silver locket lay wrapped in thin tissue. Alessandro stared at it for a long time before saying that locket belonged to her father. He said it disappeared the night he died. She asked what was inside. He said no one knew. The last man who tried to open it was killed before he could tell the secret. They sat in silence for a moment. Alessandro's expression softened as he looked at her. He said her father must have trusted her to find it someday. She didn't know what to say. He closed the box and placed it on the desk, promising to keep it safe until they understood what it meant. Outside, thunder rumbled again in the distance. He turned to her, saying they were running out of time. If Vescari wanted that locket, it wasn't just for money. It was for something far more dangerous. He said he would end it before it reached her again. The next morning, Alessandro called every ally he had left. The house became a command post. Phones ringing, men running back and forth. Elena stayed near his office, feeling out of place but unable to leave. Matteo returned with grim news. Vescari's men had been spotted near the docks. Alessandro's focus sharpened. He ordered his convoy to prepare. She tried to speak, but he silenced her with a look that wasn't harsh, just final. She understood what it meant. He didn't expect to come back from this one. Her chest tightened as she watched him strap on his shoulder holster. Before leaving, Alessandro placed the locket in her hand. He told her to keep it safe, no matter what. She asked what would happen if he didn't return. He didn't answer. His hand brushed hers briefly, the touch steady but fleeting. Then he turned and walked out. His men following. The sound of engines filled the courtyard. When the gates closed, the house felt emptier than ever. Elena stood alone in the foyer, staring at the locket. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried every secret neither of them were ready to face. Hours later, the silence shattered. Distant gunfire echoed from beyond the hills. The staff ran to the windows, whispering. Matteo barked orders, telling everyone to stay calm. Elena clutched the locket, afraid to ask what was happening. The noise grew closer, then faded, then rose again. When Matteo answered a call on his radio, his face went pale. He left without saying a word. She followed quietly, staying in the shadows. In the garage, Matteo was loading weapons into a bag. She caught only one sentence from his phone. "They've taken him." Her knees weakened, and the room tilted. She leaned against the wall, trying to process what she'd heard. Alessandro was captured. Matteo hung up the call and froze when he saw her. He cursed under his breath and told her to go back to her room. She refused. He hesitated, then admitted the truth. Vescari's men ambushed them near the docks. Alessandro had been taken alive, though not for long, if Vescari got what he wanted. Elena's grip on the locket tightened. She said she was going after him. Matteo told her she'd only get herself killed. She said dying didn't scare her anymore. Matteo stared at her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. He handed her a folded map and said there was an old factory near the river. That was where Vescari used to conduct business. If they had Alessandro, That's where he'd be. She thanked him quietly. He told her she was making a mistake, but she was already walking toward the door. She took one of the cars and drove through the rain, the map on the passenger seat. The headlights cut through fog and darkness, leading her straight toward the place she swore she'd never return to. When she reached the factory, the building loomed against the river, its windows shattered, walls blackened from old fires. She parked far enough away and stepped into the mud. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and thick with the smell of rust. She clutched the locket tight in her hand and crept closer. Through a gap in the wall, she saw men moving inside, shadows carrying weapons. Then she saw him. Alessandro, tied to a chair, blood on his temple but still sitting upright, his gaze steady. Across from him stood Marco Vescari, older now, but still recognizable. Her breath caught, but she stayed silent, hidden behind broken metal. Vescari spoke, though she couldn't hear the words. He paced slowly around Alessandro, his hand occasionally gesturing toward something unseen. Then one of the guards stepped forward, holding a small box, the same one Alessandro had given her earlier. Her blood ran cold. They had found a duplicate, or worse, a decoy. Vescari opened it and stared at the empty space inside. His smile vanished. He hit Alessandro across the face, demanding the real one. Alessandro spat blood but said nothing. She knew he wouldn't betray her. Not now. She waited until the guards stepped away, then slipped through a side door, moving carefully through the shadows. The floor creaked under her feet, but the sound of rain on the roof masked her movements. She reached the corner of the room where the power box was. Using a rusted metal rod, she pulled it open and ripped a handful of wires free. The lights inside flickered violently, then died, plunging everything into darkness. Shouts erupted. She moved toward Alessandro's chair, cutting the ropes with a shard of glass she found. He turned his head slightly, recognizing her instantly. Before they could move, a flashlight beam cut through the dark. Vescari's voice rang out, furious and sharp. He fired his gun blindly into the shadows. Elena ducked, pulling Alessandro down with her. Bullets struck the walls, sparks flying. She crawled forward, dragging him toward the doorway. The locket slipped from her pocket, clattering onto the floor. Vescari noticed the sound and turned. His voice grew louder, angrier, calling her by her old name. She froze, realizing he still remembered it. Then Alessandro pulled her forward, and they disappeared into the smoke-filled hallway together. They stumbled through the hallway, smoke filling the air, the sound of boots closing in behind them. Alessandro leaned heavily on her shoulder, his breathing shallow but steady. She guided him toward a side door, every step echoing like a warning. Behind them, Vescari shouted for his men to find the woman. They burst through the exit into the rain-soaked yard behind the factory. The river stretched wide and black ahead of them. Alessandro collapsed to one knee, clutching his side. She pulled him up again, refusing to leave him. She wasn't running this time, not from this. They hid behind a rusted truck, catching their breath. Alessandro's face was pale, blood mixing with the rain. He whispered that the locket had fallen inside. She said she knew, but there was no time to go back. He gripped her wrist, saying that what was inside mattered more than either of them. She looked toward the factory, flames now licking the windows. The fire she'd started when cutting the wires was spreading. She made her choice before fear could stop her. She handed him a broken pipe and told him to wait. Then she ran back toward the fire. The heat hit her before she even reached the door. Smoke burned her throat as she pushed through the wreckage. The lights were gone, but she could still see flashes of orange as the fire spread through the walls. She crawled across the floor, searching. Vescari's men shouted in confusion, their vision blurred by the thick smoke. Her hand brushed against something metal. She grabbed it, the locket. But before she could stand, a shadow loomed in front of her. Marco Vescari, coughing but alive, his gun raised. He recognized her instantly and smiled through the ash. She froze in place. He said her name, the old one she had buried years ago. The sound of it broke something inside her. He told her she could have saved herself by returning what was his. She said it was never his to begin with. He laughed, saying her father died for less than that. She clutched the locket, holding it close to her chest. His gun lowered slightly as he spoke again, asking if she even knew what it was. She didn't answer. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a shot rang out behind him. Alessandro was there. Viscari fell against the floor, wounded, but not dead. Alessandro staggered forward, his gun still smoking. He told her to move, but Viscari laughed through the blood. He said killing him wouldn't change what the locket held. Alessandro grabbed Elena's hand, pulling her toward the exit. They barely made it out before the ceiling caved in behind them. The explosion shook the ground. They stumbled toward the car, both coughing, burned, but alive. Alessandro looked back at the inferno, saying that nothing about this would end here. She held up the locket and said maybe it could. They drove in silence through the night, the firelight fading behind them. The locket rested in her lap, heavy and warm. Alessandro's breathing grew uneven, but he refused to stop. He said there was one man left who could open it safely, a former ally now living far from the city. She asked who he was. Alessandro said his name was Rinaldi, a forger who once worked for both families. If the locket contained what he suspected, it wasn't money or property, it was information. He didn't explain further, but his tone told her it was something powerful enough to kill for. They reached a small safe house near the edge of town. Alessandro parked the car behind an abandoned barn and stumbled inside. She helped him sit on an old couch. He said Rinaldi would arrive by morning. She cleaned his wound as best she could, her hands steady despite the exhaustion. He told her he should have sent her away long ago, that her presence had made him weak. She said weakness wasn't what she saw in him. For the first time, he smiled. Not the cruel smirk he used with others, but something quieter, almost human. Then he closed his eyes to rest. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the first traces of dawn break through the clouds. The locket lay on the table beside her, glinting faintly in the pale light. She turned it over and noticed faint scratches near the clasp, forming small letters. They spelled her father's initials. Her throat tightened. She thought about all the years she had blamed herself for his death, the mark on her wrist, and the silence she'd carried since. She picked up the locket again and whispered a promise to him, one she never got to make while he was alive. When morning came, a knock echoed through the safe house. Alessandro stirred, his hand reaching for his gun. Elena opened the door to find a thin, older man with gray hair and cautious eyes. He introduced himself as Rinaldi. Alessandro nodded for him to come in. Rinaldi studied the locket carefully, muttering about old DeMarco codes and lock mechanisms. He said he could open it, but warned them they might not like what they found. Alessandro told him to do it anyway. Elena sat beside him, her hands gripping her knees, waiting for the secret that had destroyed so many lives. Rinaldi worked in silence, twisting a small tool inside the locket's edge. A faint click echoed through the room. He opened it carefully, revealing a tiny strip of metal engraved with numbers. Alessandro's eyes widened. It wasn't a key or jewel, it was a code. Rinaldi said it was connected to a series of offshore accounts set up decades ago under the DeMarco name. Money, influence, power, all tied to the war between families. Alessandro realized the truth then. Her father had stolen the code to keep it from being used. Viscari had tortured him for it, and now it was theirs. Elena stared at the numbers, her stomach twisting. All of this, the pain, the scars, the deaths, was over greed. Alessandro closed the locket and handed it back to her. He said she could decide what to do with it. She looked at him in disbelief. He said he didn't need power anymore. He wanted peace. She didn't answer. For years, peace had been a dream she didn't believe existed. Outside, Rinaldi packed his things quickly, saying he would disappear again. Before leaving, he told her that sometimes destroying what everyone wants is the only way to survive. His words lingered. After Rinaldi left, Alessandro stood slowly, wincing from the pain in his ribs. He said they needed to move before anyone tracked them there. She asked where they would go. He said nowhere yet. That first, he had to finish something. She watched him gather his things and realized he was preparing for another fight. She stepped forward and said she wouldn't let him go alone again. He started to argue, but saw the resolve in her eyes. Finally, he nodded. Together, they left the safe house, driving toward the ruins of her old family home, where everything had begun. The road to the old house was lined with dead trees and overgrown fields. Elena stared out the window, lost in thought. She hadn't been here since the night she escaped. When they arrived, the house looked even smaller than she remembered. The windows were shattered, the roof half collapsed. Alessandro stepped out first, scanning the surroundings. She followed, clutching the locket. The air felt heavy with memories. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Her father's chair still faced the window, untouched by time. She whispered his name once, her voice barely breaking the silence. Alessandro began searching the house methodically, checking for anything useful. Elena wandered to her old bedroom. The walls were faded, but her childhood drawings were still faintly visible beneath the peeling paint. She knelt beside the old dresser and pulled it open. Inside, under a pile of broken toys, was a rusted tin box. She opened it and found a piece of paper folded many times. It contained a message written in her father's handwriting. "If you're reading this, you were right to run. Trust only what your heart knows to be clean." Tears blurred the ink before she could finish. She showed the note to Alessandro. He read it silently, then said her father must have known this day would come. She asked what he thought clean meant. He said maybe it wasn't about people, but choices. She realized then that he had already decided what to do with the code. He looked at her and asked what she wanted. She thought of the lives ruined by both families, the people who never had a choice. She said she didn't want the money, the name, or the legacy. She just wanted it to stop. He nodded, understanding completely. They built a small fire in the fireplace, the last one that old house would ever see. Alessandro placed the locket in her hand and said the choice was hers. She stared at it for a long time, feeling its weight, hearing faint echoes of the past. Then she tossed it into the flames. The metal hissed, darkened, and finally split open, the code turning to ash. Alessandro watched quietly. There was no anger in his eyes, only relief. The empire built on secrets was gone in seconds, and for the first time in years, the room felt still. The silence that followed was different. Peaceful, almost sacred. The fire crackled softly, lighting their faces. Alessandro sat beside her, saying that destroying the code meant they'd both lost everything their worlds had built. She said maybe that was the point. He smiled faintly, saying she was stronger than he'd ever been. She didn't feel strong, just tired. They stayed there until the fire died down to embers. Outside, the rain started again, washing the soot from the broken windows. She looked at her wrist. The scar seemed lighter, less angry, maybe even healing. They left before dawn. The road was quiet, the world washed clean by rain. Alessandro said there was no going back now, that the DeMarco name would fade once people realized the fortune was gone. She said she didn't mind disappearing either. He looked at her and asked where she would go. She said she didn't know yet, but anywhere was better than running from ghosts. He reached into his coat and handed her a folded piece of paper, a receipt for a small cafe near the harbor. He said it was in her name. She didn't know what to say. He told her it was a clean start, a place where no one knew them. She wanted to thank him but couldn't find the words. He said he would visit when he could, though she doubted he meant it. Their worlds didn't fit together, not in peace. Still, she smiled. As they reached the crossroads, he stopped the car and told her this was where their paths split. She unbuckled her seatbelt slowly, looking at him one last time. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Sometimes silence said more than any promise ever could. She stepped out into the morning air. The sun was breaking through the clouds, the first light touching the wet pavement. She turned to see his car already pulling away. The sound of the engine faded until there was only the wind. She looked down at her wrist, the red thread still tied loosely there. She unwound it and let it fall to the ground. Then she walked toward the harbor, where she could already smell salt and coffee. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time she felt free to find out. Months passed. The cafe by the harbor became her new world. She worked quietly, serving travelers and locals who never asked too many questions. The smell of roasted beans filled the air every morning. Sometimes she would catch her reflection in the window and barely recognize herself. No fear, no secrets, no need to hide her hands. She wore her sleeves short now. The scar remained, but it was no longer something to conceal. It was a reminder of what she had survived and what she had chosen to let go of. One afternoon, while closing up, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a small watch that only ticked at midnight. A note was attached in Alessandro's handwriting. "For what time we borrowed." She smiled faintly, setting it beside the counter. The bell above the cafe door chimed softly as a customer entered, a tall man in a dark coat. For a second, her heart stopped, but it wasn't him. Still, she caught herself looking toward the window, half expecting a familiar car parked outside. The thought made her laugh quietly. Some habits didn't fade easily. Later that night, she walked along the harbor, the air cool and still. The sea reflected the lights from the town, shimmering like distant memories. She stopped by the water's edge and held the watch in her hand. It began ticking as the clock tower struck midnight. The sound was soft, rhythmic, alive. She whispered a quiet thank you to Alessandro, to her father, to the past. The wind carried it away. For the first time, she didn't feel haunted by what she'd lost. She felt grounded by what remained. Peace wasn't loud. It was simply the absence of running. The next morning, the cafe opened as usual. Regular customers came and went, unaware of the history that lingered in the woman behind the counter. Elena smiled easily now, greeting each one with calm warmth. The news played faintly on the radio. Reports of old criminal empires crumbling, accounts frozen, families dissolving. She listened quietly, knowing exactly what they were talking about. She didn't gloat. She simply poured another cup of coffee and turned the volume down. Outside, the sky cleared, and the world moved on without asking her permission. For once, that felt like enough. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, a faint bell rang from the harbor. She looked up, recognizing the sound that had once haunted her. Now it sounded different. Gentler, almost comforting. She stepped outside, the breeze brushing her face. Somewhere far beyond the docks, she thought she saw a figure standing near a parked car, watching quietly. She didn't move toward it. She didn't need to. Whether it was real or memory didn't matter. The scar on her wrist caught the last light of day, glowing faintly like it had forgiven her for surviving. Weeks passed quietly. The cafe became part of the town's rhythm, its bell chiming each time a door opened. Elena moved through her days with calm precision, her heart no longer pulled between fear and longing. She sometimes caught herself glancing toward the sea, half expecting a familiar figure, but the water only reflected the sky. Still, she felt him there in small ways, in the hum of the espresso machine, the sound of rain, the faint tick of the midnight watch resting beside her counter. Some absences felt less like loss and more like quiet companionship. One morning, as she arranged the pastries, she found an envelope slipped beneath the cafe door. No address, just her name. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the DeMarco estate, now empty, the gates rusting under overgrown vines. On the back was written, "The Empire sleeps. Let it." She smiled faintly, recognizing Alessandro's handwriting. It wasn't a goodbye, only a confirmation that they had both survived the fire. She tucked the photo into her apron pocket and went back to work, the steady sound of the coffee grinder blending with the heartbeat of her new life. That evening, the sky turned orange over the harbor. A child dropped a toy near her door, and when Elena bent to pick it up, she noticed a familiar mark on its string, a small red thread tied around the wrist of a wooden puppet. It made her pause. She hadn't seen that color in months. She smiled gently, realizing it wasn't a warning anymore. It was just a thread, nothing more. She tied it to the cafe's bell cord, where it fluttered softly with the breeze, a quiet reminder that even scars could become symbols of peace. At night, she sometimes dreamed of the mansion again, not in fear, but as if walking through old memories. The rooms were empty, sunlight pouring through open windows. Alessandro stood near the grand staircase, alive but distant, nodding once before fading into light. When she woke, she felt no sadness. She had come to understand that some people were meant to arrive like storms, to change everything, and then leave quietly once the air was clear. The ache was still there, but it no longer hurt. It simply reminded her that she had once been brave enough to care. A few months later, the town held its annual market festival. Music filled the streets, and children ran past her cafe with ribbons in their hair. Elena watched from the doorway, her hands dusted with flour. She felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. A life without secrets, without running. A young couple asked her to take their photo, and when she handed the camera back, the woman complimented her bracelet. Elena glanced down, realizing she wasn't wearing one. The woman pointed instead to her scar. "It looks like a story," she said. Elena smiled softly. It was. That night, she sat on the cafe's back steps, watching lanterns float over the water. Their reflections shimmered across the surface like drifting memories. She thought about her father, Alessandro, and all the names she had carried like armor. The wind carried laughter from the docks, and she realized how far she had come from the frightened woman who once hid her hands. Now, she could touch the world again without flinching. She whispered her real name under her breath for the first time in years, letting it dissolve into the night without fear of who might hear. The next morning, a small black car appeared near the harbor. She didn't notice at first, until a customer mentioned it. When she stepped outside, the driver handed her a sealed envelope and said nothing before leaving. Inside was a folded letter and a key wrapped in ribbon. The letter was short. "For the house by the sea. You'll know which one." Her hands trembled slightly as she read it again. She looked toward the coastline where a narrow road led beyond the docks. For a long time, she just stood there, unsure if she should follow. That evening, curiosity overcame hesitation. She closed the cafe early and followed the narrow road along the cliffs. The wind smelled of salt and wildflowers. At the end stood a small stone house overlooking the ocean. The windows were open, curtains swaying. Inside, everything was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books. On the counter sat a note in the same handwriting as before: "A quiet place deserves quiet company." She smiled through tears. There was no one there, but the house already felt alive, as if it had been waiting just for her. She spent the night there, listening to the waves crash below. The world outside faded until only the rhythm of the sea remained. In the morning, sunlight poured across the floor. She found a small box on the table. Inside was the broken locket, its pieces carefully polished and rejoined. It no longer opened, but it gleamed as if reborn. Beneath it was a single sentence written in pencil: "Some things are meant to stay closed." She held it to her chest, smiling. The past wasn't gone, it was simply finished, sealed with peace instead of pain. Days turned into weeks. Elena split her time between the cafe and the small house. Her life became quiet, but not lonely. She grew herbs in the garden and baked bread in the mornings. Locals often waved as they passed, calling her by name. Sometimes, when the fog rolled in, she'd imagine Alessandro walking through it, his coat catching the wind. Maybe he was out there, somewhere rebuilding himself just as she had. Whether she saw him again didn't matter anymore. His presence had already shaped her into someone new, someone who no longer needed to hide. One afternoon, as she wiped down the cafe counter, an older woman came in, holding a small radio. She asked if she could leave it while she shopped. Elena agreed. When she turned it on, a familiar voice filled the room, a news report about the dismantling of old crime networks and the arrest of several key figures. Among the names mentioned was Carlo Vascari, nephew of the man who started it all. Elena exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. The cycle had finally broken. The empire that once controlled her life had ended without her needing to lift a hand. That evening she walked back to the seaside house with a bag of groceries. The sunset painted the horizon in gold and rose. She placed the groceries down, lit a candle, and opened the windows. The faint sound of a bell drifted from the harbor, carried by the breeze. She paused, closing her eyes. It no longer frightened her. It was only sound now, one that reminded her she had survived every echo it ever carried. She whispered a quiet thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the world for finally letting her stay still. Months later, Travelers passing through the town began telling stories about a woman by the harbor cafe, how she listened more than she spoke, how her kindness felt effortless, how people left her shop lighter than when they entered. Some said she had once belonged to something powerful, but no one knew for sure. Elena never confirmed or denied anything. When asked about the faint scar on her wrist, she would simply say it was from another life. That answer seemed to satisfy everyone. The truth didn't need to be told anymore. It had already been lived. On the anniversary of her arrival in town, she walked along the shore at dawn. The waves were calm, the sand cool under her feet. She carried a small jar filled with ashes, the remains of the locket. She opened it and let the wind take them. The particles rose and disappeared into the sunlight. She smiled softly, realizing how light she felt. The weight of years of guilt, of secrets, had finally lifted. She wasn't defined by survival anymore. She was defined by peace, by the quiet courage it took to build something new from ruin. That night, she returned to the cafe and found a single flower resting on the counter. No note, no name, just a white lily wrapped in paper. She placed it in a glass of water and sat by the window, watching the rain return. Maybe it was from Alessandro, maybe not. Either way, it meant she wasn't forgotten. The bell above the door swayed gently, its red thread still tied in place. She smiled at it, remembering the fear it once symbolized. Now it was a thread of connection, proof that even pain could be transformed into something tender. As the months rolled by, the cafe became a small haven for lost souls, travelers, wanderers, and those looking to start over. Elena never asked their stories. She didn't need to. She could see it in their eyes. The same weariness, the same desire for calm. She offered them coffee, warmth, and silence. Some left notes of thanks. Others just left lighter hearts. At night she'd read their scribbled words and smile, realizing she had become what she once needed most, a place where broken people could rest without explaining themselves. That, she thought, was its own kind of redemption. Winter arrived with soft snow blanketing the town. The harbor grew quiet, but the cafe lights glowed warmly against the frost. One night, as she closed up, she saw a figure outside, tall and familiar. Her breath caught as he stepped closer, his face partly hidden beneath a scarf. It was Alessandro. Time had aged him, but his eyes were the same, calm, sharp, kind. He smiled faintly, asking if she still made coffee this late. She nodded, unable to speak. He followed her inside, the bell ringing once, the red thread trembling gently above the door. They sat by the counter, steam rising from 2 untouched cups. He said he had come to see for himself what peace looked like. She said it wasn't as quiet as it seemed, but it was real. He smiled, saying that was enough. He told her he had left everything behind, the DeMarco name, the power, the wars. He lived simply now, just a man with too many memories. She said that made 2 of them. The silence between them was gentle this time, not filled with fear or secrets, only mutual understanding, born from shared survival. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. She didn't open it right away. He said it wasn't a goodbye, only a map in case their paths crossed again. She walked him to the door, the snow falling softly outside. Before stepping out, he looked back once and said she had changed more than he thought possible. She replied that maybe he had too. He smiled, touched her hand briefly, then disappeared into the white haze of the falling snow. The bell chimed once, echoing like a heartbeat in the quiet cafe. She stood by the door long after he was gone, watching the snow cover his footprints. The paper on the counter called to her. She unfolded it and found a simple drawing, a lighthouse on a cliff overlooking the sea, marked with a small red cross. No words, no directions, just that. She smiled, understanding what it meant. It wasn't a destination, it was a promise. If either of them ever got lost again, they'd find each other where the light touched the edge of the sea. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. Years passed. The red thread above the cafe door faded to pale pink, but Elena never replaced it. The watch still ticked at midnight, and the flower from that night had long dried but remained pressed between pages of her journal. The scar on her wrist was faint now, more memory than wound. The townspeople still came, still left lighter than they arrived. She grew older, her hair silvering, but her eyes stayed clear. Sometimes she caught her reflection and thought she looked more like her father, quiet strength beneath calm grace. She took that as a gift. One late evening, she closed the cafe for the last time that year. Outside, the harbor shimmered with lanterns, just like the first festival she had seen. She locked the door, turned the sign, and took a deep breath. The bell above her gave one final soft ring. She looked up at it with gratitude. Every sound, every thread, every scar had led her here to peace, earned, not given. She walked toward the shore, the cold biting her cheeks, but her heart warm. The moonlight reflected off the water like scattered silver. Everything felt whole. At the lighthouse beyond the harbor, a faint light glowed in the window. She smiled, knowing exactly what it meant. She didn't rush. She simply stood there, watching the beam sweep slowly across the dark sea. It was a signal, steady and calm. A reminder that she was never truly alone. She whispered a quiet good night, the same way she once did to ghosts. Only now, they were at rest. She turned back toward town, the snow crunching beneath her feet. Every step a small affirmation that life could be rebuilt from anything, even from fire. The next morning, a new day began like any other. The cafe bell chimed. The air filled with warmth and laughter. Elena stood behind the counter, her movements easy, her smile genuine. A child pointed at her wrist and asked about the faint mark there. She said it used to be a scar, but now it was just part of her story. The child nodded and ran off, leaving her laughing softly. The sun spilled through the windows, catching the faded red thread and the gleaming countertop. For the first time, she felt truly home. That night, as the watch ticked softly at midnight, Elena sat by the window of her small seaside house. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, calm and shimmering beneath the stars. She thought of everyone she had loved and lost, of every secret that once weighed her down. Now, there was only peace. She touched her wrist, the scar barely visible, and smiled. Some stories end with fire, others with silence. Hers ended with light on water, a steady bell in the distance, and the quiet knowing that healing is just another word for love.